All right, so I'll start off with some good news. As I tell you this, the lesson here is look around for good news because there's lots of it in places you wouldn't imagine. And the good news is, if you listen to our podcast, we had James mentioned on the last episode, a woman was thrown off of a flight because she was attempting to breastfeed her hairless cat. And if you look, of course, you see all kinds of things about people, throwing fits about masks and being thrown off flights and all of this. And so why is this good news? These are people who, because of their weird behavior or whatever, it seems to be a minor thing, are getting thrown off of airplanes. 50 years ago, air travel was only for the rich. Regular people couldn't afford it. And now, even when I was a kid, very few people in the middle class ever flew. And now everybody flies. In fact, not only do we fly all the time and it's so cheap, we can afford to throw hissy fits over masks and get thrown off of planes. That's a demonstration of how incredibly rich we have become. That you can afford, a regular person can afford to get thrown off of a flight for trying to nurse a hairless cat. That's astounding.
There's like three things wrong with that. Good. It's weird you wanted to talk about this because when I was a boy, I was probably 8 years old. We went to Disney World in Florida. I grew up in Connecticut, so it's not that long a trip. And it turns out, I found out later, my parents had saved up for 2 years.
Yeah,
that we might afford, and I was an only child. The three of us might afford a trip to Florida. Yeah. My original thing, I don't know if this will work. How many of you guys are self-described introverts? Yeah.
Wow. You're a minority in the overall population.
Yeah, but all the best people are introverts, right? And the entire world is set up against us. Right. Every single damn thing that you have to do. The worst sentence ever heard by introverts. Please break up into small groups. Right? Things like this. And the COVID has made the world safe for us. What do? We meet on Zoom. I can turn it off the minute I get tired of it. I have to stand far away from any other people. I went to a Christmas party, which is hell for an introvert. You all know this. And I only spoke to one person there. Perfect. So I think maybe we've turned the corner on all of this kind of hostility towards our introverted friends. And maybe we can come out on top a little better than we have. But I think we are actually the big winner in the COVID sweepstakes. It's hard to find a winner, right? There's a lot of losers you can point to. But I think we kind of win here.
So we're both serious introverts, which you wouldn't think because we spend so much time talking to people like this. Talking to you like this is great. I find it fine, but my God, don't approach me.
Yeah, that's right.
And ask me things.
Yeah, perhaps you'd like to tell them your COVID story.
My COVID story. So it's still unclear whether I had COVID, but this was early in the thing, like May of 2020, and my son came down with an absolutely horrendous flu, laid out for like 2 weeks. And then my wife, same thing, horrible, worst flu we've ever seen. And then I came down with it, and she insisted that I get tested for COVID. I don't want to get tested for COVID. So she was nagging me about it. I said, fine, I will go get tested for COVID. And this was, in the early days, the way you had to do it, there's a drive-through thing, and they come out and they do the test. And the test involved, of course, I guess they got better tests now. But the original test was they take this stick and they basically jam it into your brain. And so, they do this and they jam this thing into my brain and they go away and I start feeling woozy and everything's getting black and I pass out and I wake up with my wife beating on me, like screaming, what the hell's wrong with you? This kind of thing. Anyway, the long and short of it is,
don't forget the vomiting.
Yeah, and the vomiting and everything, right? And it turns out there's a nerve that runs in your brain, like back here where nothing ever touches it, right? It's in here. except the stick, when they stuff it into your head, it can tickle this nerve. And basically, the nerve just shuts down the body. So you tickle this nerve and you get the effect that you had. So anyway, that's apparently what caused this. So people show up and ambulance and the whole thing and take me to the hospital where they put me in, because at this time in the early days of COVID, anything's wrong with you, it's COVID. So they put me in the COVID room. And the COVID room has this, they've rigged up this device that sucks the air out of the room and blows it. I got the thing cut into the window there, blows it out the thing. And all the rooms in this thing have this thing sucking, and it's loud, it's like a jet engine loud thing. And it has the effect of grabbing, you're in a hospital, right? Grabbing every germ in the hospital and funneling it into your room. And so this is, this was the thing. And I'm there for about a week doing more of these jamming the things up the thing test. And I got to the point that I was one day away from the ventilator, that, they were giving me like more and more oxygen, the whole thing. And then all of a sudden it just cleared up, and that was it. I was gone. But that was my, it's still unclear at the point. All the tests came back negative, yet all the symptoms were COVID.
I had the exact same thing, 4 or 5 months later.
Yeah, right.
Given your experience, I refused to allow my family to drive me to the hospital.
Right.
I figured if I'm going to die, I'll die.
It's at that point, and I don't know what it's like now, it was like a one-way door. You go into that hospital, you are not coming out.
And that was part of my calculation.
Yeah.
My guess is that the outcome would be the same either way.
Mm-hmm.
So screw it. My family would leave meals for me at the door. Nobody would even come in to say hello, this kind of thing. I would get Zoom messages from the kitchen, which is a little weird. So gross.
So we're
on that bit of good news.
Sorry?
On that bit of good news, I kind of struck this. Why did you guys decide you wanted to write a book? What brought you to it? How did you get along during it? Stuff like that.
I've been wanting to write a book for a long time. And James and I have written for, more than a decade. Op-eds all over the place. We've got probably 300 op-eds out there. And I wanted to write a book, something that brought everything together. And the image that I had originally was, in my mind, it was called Don't. And it was a story of all sorts of things the government shouldn't do. And so I ran it by James, and we hashed it out and decided that we would do something along the lines of how humans organize themselves. And we came to this idea of cooperation and coercion, which if you look at any time humans come together in groups of 2 or more, we organize ourselves according to principles of cooperation or principles of coercion. Everything we do is one or the other of those things. And so we started this book along those lines. And interestingly, as we went through this thing, and we both wrote it. He led on some chapters and I led on other chapters, but the book is, if you read any of the things that we write independently, it's a completely third voice. It's the two of us. So it's not like he wrote some and I wrote some. We did the whole thing. But we write this thing and we go through it, and our technique was to write it, and he would edit, or he would write and I would edit, and then we'd sit down and read it. One of us would read it to the other one and just listen to the sound of the whole thing. And we're going through all of this. We get to the last chapter, and it's not working. There are things that we were saying in the last chapter that aren't jiving with stuff that we had said earlier, and it's kind of stodgy, it's not fitting. And we came to the realization that in this last chapter, we were trying to tie up the whole story by saying cooperation's good, coercion's bad. And it may have been me. I came to the realization that this isn't a story of cooperation good and coercion bad. It's a story that sometimes you need one, sometimes you need the other, depending on what problem comes along. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes coercion is the right tool. And once we came to that realization, and it fits with the chapter or with the title, because the title is not cooperation or coercion. it's cooperation and coercion. That once you get that balance of cooperation and coercion right, you get the best outcomes for society, however you want to talk about that, income or poverty or equality or whatever it is.
This will always aggravate the anarchists, of course. But we start with Aristotle, right? Man is a political animal, man is a social animal. You can't just wave your hand at that and make it go away because you would prefer to have an anarchistic society, if there could even be such a thing when you think it through. And then we get to Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. And what he says there, I think, is the perfect thing to say, that if the government that you've got doesn't secure your safety and happiness, it's your duty to alter or abolish that government and replace it with another one, not and then do nothing. Right? So Jefferson, in a lot of ways, clearly followed Locke, but from a deeper perspective, clearly follows Aristotle. And when you start bringing these things together, it all makes a lot of sense. And the story Ant just told you is probably one that if you haven't experienced yet, you will if you go to graduate school. And I tell all my students this, write your introduction last. Get all the way to the end, come up with the conclusion you've got, and then go back and write because if you written the introduction the day you started, it would be gone wholesale. So just don't do it, put a placeholder in if you must. But usually at the end of a longish project, it's not what you thought it would be. And if it was what you thought it would be, probably not that interesting. I remember when I was in graduate school, I don't think I ever told you this. I defended my dissertation topic, right? So you get your first cut, 10, 20, 30 pages. And then I came back a year or so later for the defense of the full-blown thing. And one of the guys on the committee said, well, this looks nothing at all like what you proposed. And it didn't, it looked nothing like it. And I said, well, I learned more interesting things and we went this way instead. And even he kind of let it go at that. It was his expectation too. Probably he would have preferred a phone call to find out about it. But, you know, it's just how it goes. The book, I think the book story is kind of boring. The podcast story is better. Anthony and I have two completely different podcast stories.
Well, we start, in my mind, I had wanted to do, I've done a lot of videos, which you may have seen some of them, economics and statistics and whatnot. And I wanted to start a video series where we talk about, you know, just stuff, whatever. And contacted a friend of ours who does videos. And he said, yeah, he can help us out, get started, this sort of thing. And we got started in the first maybe 20 episodes of Words and Numbers were video, 5 to 10 minute videos. And this friend of ours came back and said, look, you probably really shouldn't be doing video. That the thing to do is audio and make it do better treatment, do a 30-minute type of thing. And so we started that and got it. I don't want to say decent follow. We got some traction. People started following us. But interestingly, our listenership rose steadily, like over the course of 2.5 years, 2% a week, which 2% doesn't sound like much, but week after week after week, you know, going over 2.5 years, ended up with decent listenership. We're now in the top one, well into the top 1% of podcasts nationwide by listenership.
Worldwide.
Sorry?
Worldwide. That's not the story that I remember. I remember Anthony badgering me, saying, we have to make videos. So there it is. That's one thing in your story that is the same with mine. And when I poked at him and said, well, what does that mean? He said, we need to read our op-eds aloud into a camera. Who wants to watch that, right? And see, they're all laughing. They would not want to watch that either. And I couldn't put them off anymore. And I finally said, okay, here's the deal. We can do it once. And after we do, we get it to an independent third party, and we'll do whatever that person says, up or down. Because I knew the answer would be down every time. And we did it. It was terrible. We sent it to the guy, and he got back with us, and he said, boy, that's terrible. And he said, but, and here's where, whenever somebody says, but, you know, you've already lost. He said, but I've just been hired at Fee to do their content. And we don't have anybody doing content. So would you like to be the first?
Fee is?
Foundation for Economic Education. And that's how they ended up sponsoring the podcast for what, its first 3 years. And that's how I remember it, right? That Sean said, that sucks. Do you want to keep doing it? Okay. And I thought for sure that I didn't want to. I thought this was a stupid idea. And then come to find out, it's the idea in the last 10 years or so that's had the biggest impact on my life. So completely wrong about what that was good
I'm
for.
sorry, what was that?
You're in, come closer. Yeah, so, you guys are all too young to really appreciate this. You will soon. In your life, there's going to be 1 or 2 decisions or periods when you learn something that actually utterly define your life. But you won't know it until you're about 3-4 years past it. And then you'll look and say, oh, of course it was that. And the podcast is probably the second one for me. So it turned out to be an unalloyed good. Everything about it has just been better than I could have conceived.
But both with the podcast and the book, what was important in both instances is that you be, in the one hand, you have a vision. On the other hand, you be flexible. And so when you realize, this vision isn't going to pan out, don't keep beating on it, pivot onto something else.
And that's the funny part with the podcast, right? Because we started as like a 6-minute video and literally nobody wanted it. And we started thinking, okay, what's it going to become? And we did a little bit of research and we asked people when they listened to podcasts. And the answers were always the same. On my commute to work, average commute length in the United States, 24 minutes. Or when I do cardio at the gym, average cardio session, 30 minutes. I looked at that and said, well, we got to do 30-minute audio. That's clearly the right answer. We could have also done an hour 15 and dug in way deeper, but you get a much shallower follower pool if you do it that way. So we switched it to 30-minute audio, and that worked, but it didn't work all that well. And then we decided we were going to each present 2 items from the news and then the main conversation. And then after a while, we had to drop the second one, and we replaced that with the foolishness of the week. And by the time we got there, the whole thing was clicking. The format was so easy for us to follow that we wouldn't have to take a break. We wouldn't have to read notes. It would just be nice and quick. So where we used to spend probably 3 hours recording a 6-minute video, we, in a half-hour audio podcast, we probably spend 45 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
So we just hit our stride the minute it got to the format it is now. Everything just started to work.
And we've, one of the interesting things that's happened, we started a Facebook group, Words and Numbers Backstage, just as a place for kind of to accompany the podcast, and you post it there, maybe get some following. And interestingly, the thing has taken on kind of a life of its own. It started out as being fans of the podcast, and still is largely fans of the podcast. But there are a number of people, in fact, somebody said recently he joined Words and Numbers Backstage because it's a place to discuss stuff. It's the unicorn of the internet, that people could come here and disagree about stuff without calling each other names. It's constructive discussion, mostly. But a couple of people have said, astounded us because they're participating in the conversation. And at one point we'll say, oh, you guys have a podcast?
Yeah, I've gotten that too. It's a little disconcerting.
Right, yeah. But it's become a place for, which was our vision for the podcast. That we have an opinion and we're going to state it, but we want to be respectful of people, hear out people's arguments on the other side. We made it our mission to build bridges between the left and the right, broadly speaking.
We're convinced that everybody wants exactly the same things, that the ends are always the same. People don't wake up in the morning and say, how can we make school children more stupid? Everybody wants education to work and wants to be cost effective. What they disagree about is the means, how you would achieve these things. And if we can all stipulate to the ends, we don't have to have moral discussions. Now we can have technical discussions, right? What's the best way to arrange what we've got in a finite resource situation to achieve these ends? And where does all the trouble come from right now? It seems all to come from people who are unwilling to believe that their neighbors are reasonable, decent human beings. And if you ask them that at a Little League game, They would say, of course they are. But if you ask them that in the context of a political conversation, their hearts are filled with hatred. So we're gonna have to find a way around that. There's, and I don't think we're gonna be the guys who say, oh yeah, do it this way, and then it'll always work, but at least we're pitching out there. And I think other people are starting to follow our lead. Been a while.
Yeah, Backstage has become, we started off heavily monitoring it because, we talk about things that are divisive there, and we've had, over the years, had to kick out a couple of people for ungentlemanly.
I've bumped three in the whole time.
Yeah, but the thing has taken on a life of its own, and now in providing an example for civil conversation, the people there now, there's I think 1,600 people on the group, have taken up that, and they now provide example to new people who come along. They kind of self-monitor in the sense of saying, somebody comes out and says, well, you're an idiot because of X. Someone else will say, no, hang on. It's not about the person, it's about the topic. Let's stick to the topic.
Yeah, they've been actually quite good about it, better than I could have ever imagined. So it's been nice having all these things, right? And by having all these things, we can do all kinds of other cool things. I never really saw it happening, but in no small part, this is what drives us going out, meeting people like you. Right? Our whole lives have changed because of that one argument we had about we should read things into a camera. And look, it's easy to see it in retrospect. In the moment, it was impossible to see. So the only advice I really have for young people is give everything a minute to land. Don't become too frustrated with things, because the thing that will define you is something you cannot conceive of yet. And, see what you can do.
And keep in mind, yes, think about what it is you want to do, what your vision is, but also give significant weight to what do people want. Think about what makes other people happy, and that's what will gain you traction.
This is probably the beginning of the next real book that we write, The Happiness. What was the exact wording? The Happiness Business. And I realized this when I was working at St. Vincent College right around the corner from where Aunt lives. And I was in the office and I hated it. And I hated every minute that I was in the office. And I would walk in, I would close the door and just, skulk around in there and then go home. And it seemed like maybe the problem was mine. I came to the realization that it was my problem, not the world. When you have a different problem or vision than the rest of the world, trust me, it's your fault. And it was my fault entirely. And I realized that in order to be successful, you've got to make other people happy, right? This is one of them central lessons of classical economics. Political scientists don't hear it very much. And I decided at that moment that I would heretofore be in the happiness business, not in the political philosophy professor business. So I started calling people who I knew, tell them I'm looking for, extra work, side work, and what would make you happy. And the odd thing is, when you ask a person what will make him happy, every single one of them answers. You get a list. And once you get a list, you can say things like I started saying, well, I can't do numbers 1 or 2, but number 3, I can help you with that. And before you knew it, I had more contract work than I knew what to do with. And all of that led straight to all of the success I had probably in the second half of my career, because in the first half, there wasn't. I was just treading water. So you see these things stretching out before you, and it's easy to see it once you see it. You can't unsee it afterwards, but it's very difficult for that first time. And I came to the understanding, I'd always told my students that the most important sentence ever written in any earthly language is we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Because you can draw every single revolutionary movement in the entire world right back to that sentence. And that's kind of astonishing, right? You find communists making it, you find women making it, you find blacks in the United States after slavery, they make that argument too. They made it before slavery. But then I started thinking about modern life, and is that the everyday thing that makes human life wonderful? And I think it's a precondition, but the second sentence, the one that gets spoken, that's more important than all the other words, is how can I help you? That is a nugget at the heart of every business. But you have to be outward facing. You have to want to make your fellow man happy. And how can I help you is a profound sentence, if only you think about it for a second. Most of us don't, because we hear it so much every day. Probably the only time I think about anything when somebody in a store or a restaurant talks to me is when the Chick-fil-A people say my pleasure. And that's just weird. Yeah. But think about Jefferson and then the commercial sentence and merge them in your mind. And I think there's a roadmap there for just about everybody to be free and happy.
Is that a segue for questions from these?
Sure.
Okay, we primed you. Everybody wrote down a question.
Who's got the mean-spirited ones?
Yeah, so Haley, Elder, start with yours, please.
Okay. So I don't remember what episode, but in one of the podcasts, you said that people with higher education are the hardest to communicate about changing their minds. Are there any experiences, significant ones where this happened to you?
Where we successfully changed someone's mind?
Yeah.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, there was this idiot that I worked with who was an anarchist.
Yeah, I suppose so. So James changed my mind. I was, for a long time, was an anarchist. And still, I love the idea of anarchism. And we would argue this back and forth a lot. And he finally changed my mind.
Took about, what, 3-4 years?
It did, yeah.
It took a while.
Yeah.
And look, if you could see the 20-year-old version of me, we would share almost nothing. Right? Whatever his ideas were, they're not my ideas. It's hard to say with any precision when these things happen, because you live kind of this amoebic life where you just drift all over the place. You can't really have much of a plan in any one direction. But somewhere along the way, I just, I think I was conservative, hardcore. I voted for Pat Buchanan in the primary because George Bush had said, read my lips, no new taxes. And then he turned around and had new taxes. So I think, okay, anybody will be better than that, even the evil Pat Buchanan. And somewhere in that period, the powers that be were really all over homosexuals. It was just terrible. And I remember asking around, why would anybody care? Why on earth would anybody care what somebody else does in the privacy of his own? And then it was drug use, marijuana specifically. Why on earth would we want to tell people that they can't do this if they want to? And then I came to the realization, I had this brilliant original thought. If there's no victim, there's no crime. Turns out it wasn't anywhere near original. And the people that I landed with after I started thinking about this were all self-declared classical liberals. And I very quickly found my way to that camp. That seemed exactly right to me. I never had the opportunity to meet any of them. When I was an undergraduate, I used to have to work third shift to pay for school. So when it came time for spring break or whatever, I wasn't going anywhere. But once I found that there were a group of people not unlike me, it was a comforting day. And now there's not enough of them, but at least there are some. And if you have some, you can build something.
It's you asked specifically about people in higher education, and they're an odd group of people in that they're paid to develop opinions about things. And when we develop opinions, it's not like, well, I think this. We spend a tremendous amount of time coming up with rationales for why this opinion is correct. And so to ask an academic to change his opinion on something is an extremely heavy lift. If you were to ask me to change my opinion on the role of government in society, you're asking me to undo 10 years worth of work. Now, you might be right, but holy crap, if you are, you've just demonstrated I've wasted my past 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm incredibly invested in not changing this opinion.
And you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. We see everything underneath the water line, and it is excessive. But notice what Ant just said, because it's a good way to police what you're seeing. We spend a lot of time on one issue. Now, if you turn on Fox or MSNBC or whichever partisan news outlet you prefer, what you start to realize is that they have the exact same people talking about 8 different issues a month. And then the next month it's 4 drop off, then there are these new 4. None of those people have done any of the research to support their points of view if they're giving them 8 a month. I would probably, I mean, look, I would give opinions on probably 3 things total, because I know I've worked really hard on 3 and the rest of them probably not so much. So always be cognizant of the limitations of the people you're listening to, because they've decided that it was more important to be famous and on TV than it was to be a decent and honorable researcher. Now, we've both decided that there are things we would prefer to do too. So it's not necessarily a swipe at them for having different priorities. It is a swipe at them for presenting every single one of those issues that they pretend to have informed opinions on out in before the public. And that gets to be kind of distressing, right? You expect better from people.
What's important here is intellectual humility. You know, if you listen to our podcast, we'll do the same thing. We'll talk about lots of things and have opinions on these things. But it's important, and we try and keep this in the podcast, it's important that you maintain a sense of intellectual humility, meaning that there are some things I have an opinion on that I have spent decades thinking about. I'm pretty sure I'm correct, and I'll defend this because I've got lots of ammunition here. There are other things I've just thought less about that I still have opinions on, and we'll talk about these things, but the intellectual humility part is keeping in mind that you may be wrong. I may be wrong about this, and if you have a counter argument, to listen honestly to it. And this is how I ended up giving up my beloved anarchism, being intellectually humble, of saying, all right, James has got an argument I haven't considered, and he might be right.
And we get, I mean, I call it hate mail. It's not exactly hate mail, but we get a lot of email that takes the approach, you're wrong about this for the following reasons. And every now and then, whoever wrote it is actually much better at describing whatever that thing was than we had been.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm happy to give credit where it's due. I'm also very happy that people would take enough time to get in touch and give me some information that I didn't already have.
Right.
Right. I'm not trying to be right all the time, but I am actually trying to be right all the time. It manifests in different ways when you're humble enough to say, okay, help me out here.
Yeah, right.
Because people actually do. It's been really nice. What we found is that we always said we're marketing ourselves to well-educated non-experts. And that's the group that you kind of want to hit, right? Because well-educated experts are not going to listen to you at all. Mm-hmm. Well-educated non-experts, on the other hand, they're going to want to hang out with you forever. And how many well-educated non-experts do they deal with every day? And if you really want to make a ripple, that's the group you have to chase. It's not exactly the group people would think of, right? You think you got to chase opinion leaders. No, you don't. You got to chase these people. And even opinion leaders, right? I enter into debates, public debates from time to time. And I always walk up and say, listen, I'm here to change your minds, not his. And you might remember that crackpot that you had me debate up at Duquesne that time. Right? I could never have prevailed upon him that the sky was blue, let alone something important. But every student walked out thinking that mine was far better. My approach is far better.
Yeah, and this is the approach we take on social media when we're talking to people. And if you do any of this, I would give you this advice, that when you're arguing with someone on social media, your audience is not the person you're talking to. You're likely not going to change that person's mind. Your audience is much larger. It's the people that may not even be commenting. You don't even know they're there. They're the people who are listening to the discussion. And this is why it becomes so important that no matter what the person throws at you about you're an idiot or whatever it is, respond civilly. As mad as you might get, and we do get mad.
Yeah, you're awesome.
Respond civilly and stick to the point. And and remember that it's the people who are listening that you're talking to, not this other person.
And I have an amendment here. I will call people idiots, but only when it's funny.
Right.
I'll insult people if it can be amusing. If it's just bile, I won't do this.
So
We watched your guys' episode about like how not to fail at college. I think that's what it was. But is there any like mistakes that you, because I was told from more of like a professor's perspective. So is there any like mistakes that you guys made as students or anything you would like advise for us?
I think this one's for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where to begin? I went to college after high school the way you did. And I remember I knew it wasn't time. And I told my parents, that, look, I need to take a year off. I need to go do something meaningful. And nobody in my family had ever been to college, so they didn't really have any understanding of what I was saying. Since I was this big, they told me I was going to college. It was a point of pride around the house. And so I said, I'm going to take a year off. They said, yep, you can do that. And if you do, we'll never pay a dime for college. I said, so college it is. I'll go to college. And I went, studied things like religion, kind of egghead things, philosophy, and did very, very well that first semester. And then came home thinking everybody would be so proud. And they yelled at me a lot because what the hell kind of job are you going to get taking these classes? And they demanded that I register as a business student in the following term, which sadly I did. That was the beginning of the end. So I had 3 successive semesters that were just terrible, sub 2.0 GPAs. And then I found out that I really enjoyed liquor because, you know, when you're young, you don't get to do that. And then I said, okay, now that we've tried liquor, what's all this about drugs I hear? And I got caught smoking weed in my dorm room and they threw me out of college. So there were like 8 perfectly good reasons to throw me out. That was just one of them. So yeah, I'm the only professor you probably ever meet who admits to getting thrown out of college. I know a couple others. But yeah, so when I went back, I behaved very, very differently. The parents weren't paying for anything by then, so it got easy. Because then I could say, well, I'm paying for it. I can take anything I want, which is how it went. And I became a very serious student within minutes. Because, you know, you're allowed one mistake. You're never allowed 2. And if I screwed this one up, I'd be a dead man. So, yeah, these are the hard lessons I've learned. And as a professor, they caused me to be short with people a little bit. You know, people would show up in my class at 2 o'clock in the afternoon smelling like whiskey. And, you know, I lived that way and I know how it ends. And I always tried to save people the trouble. But what you learn is that people don't want to be saved. When they do, they'll tell you. So yeah, not a great student. 2 years completely wasted. Took me 8 years to get a bachelor's. Yeah.
you have to share with them how you got back into college.
Sure. This is an all-time favorite story, actually. I applied to UConn, the University of Connecticut, my state school, a few years later, and they rejected me out of hand. I'm pretty sure they would still reject me given my record. And so I had nothing else to do, right? You make your plans to go to school, then there's no school. I loaded the car up with my stuff anyway, got there in the middle of summer, sublet an apartment, and went down to the Old Main, the office building. I brought my rejection letter with me. And I walked in and there's a woman minding the flow of traffic. And I said, who do I go to talk to about this mistake that you all have made? And she laughed. She laughed like a hyena. She thought this was the funniest thing ever. And she said, would you like to go next door and ask all of them too, all of her friends? And I said, yep. Figured I would ask as many people as would hear it, because sooner or later, maybe something works. And the next room, they laughed at me too, very, very heartily. And then they brought me to the next one and the next and the next. Before you know it, I'm at the last office on the floor. And it's this crusty old broad. She had to be like 64 when the retirement age was 65, right? This sort of thing. She was hunched over and in the dead of summer wearing a sweater, you know the type. And she looked at me and said, how can I help you? And because I'm pretty sure she was a religious smoker. And I said, and she said, I know how to get around that. And she brought out a rule book and she said, this is the rule you want. And it was right there in black and white. If you took 24 courses and got over a certain GPA, 2.0, not terribly lofty, you could petition for admission and it's automatic. So I literally found a woman who looked at my letter, didn't laugh at me and told me how to do it. And I was only allowed to take 24 credits in that year because I could take 6 each semester and 6 each summer. So I was able to knock out the courses I needed to make the requirement in 1 year. On the downside, I had to take the worst classes you can imagine because I got to choose after literally everybody else was done. And you typically don't get great classes. So I got a couple of good ones, one that changed my life, but that was how it worked out, right? I was just unwilling to keep hearing no. And I figured I could hear no forever. All I need is one yes. And she made a copy for me, actually, of the page. She said, make sure you bring this with you when you tell them you want to be admitted. And I didn't really understand, but I started keeping a file on what people said. And I walked in after my grades posted from that 4th term. And I said, I'm here to be admitted. And they all howled with laughter. And I said, no. Here's the rule. None of them even knew it. That's how often it was used. So everything turned out fine, actually better than it could have any other way. Because when you live according to your own preferences, you make great decisions, you're willing to work hard to get those things. It's a case study really in economic thinking more than anything. I didn't realize that at the time, but that's what it was. And every good thing that happened, I mean, every good thing that happened because that one day I was unwilling to take no for an answer. So don't take no for an answer. Sometimes you don't have to. Sometimes you do, but you never know until you work on it. I was happy to humiliate myself one more time. In for a penny, in for a pound.
Yeah, so on yesterday's episode, you talked about nuclear energy, right? And you talked about how oil and biofuel companies would lobby against nuclear energy. So do you think that in the end, superior technologies are going to prevail, or do you think it's possible that companies that have inferior products that want to protect their revenue streams are able to defeat superior technologies using things like lobbying or non-competitive business practices?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on how heavily the government is already involved. And the government is already heavily involved in nuclear. You can't build a nuclear plant in this country without going through many years of getting approval from all sorts of regulatory agencies. Because of that, it's very easy if I'm a competitor to nuclear, it's very easy for me to co-opt the government and to keep you out. So in effect, the government becomes my ally unwittingly in preventing you from competing against me. So the answer is, it depends. There are some technologies, particularly stuff involving, the internet, cryptography, these sorts of things that the government is not heavily involved in. And consequently, you see, leaps and strides being made there.
You can almost see the advertisements on TV, though, for when the existing power companies want to take on the threat of solar. And you're going to see something, I can almost guarantee this, that it's going to be so ridiculous that they're going to pan over a shot of Chernobyl. They're going to show you 3 Mile Island, and then they're going to show the coal miners going off to work. And it's going to say, coal, safe, clean, American.
Right. Yeah,
You can see that this is exactly what's going to happen.
But one of the interesting things I predict is that you will see environmentalists lobbying against fusion. And the reason I believe you'll see environmentalists lobbying against fusion is because it's actually the solution. It's environmentally clean. Now that sounds weird, except understand if we were to move to an energy that is extremely low cost, so it's going to get wide adoption, it's environmentally sound, it puts the environmentalists out of business.
You've got a couple of examples that you can think of in your mind for what this actually means. And the first one I want to put your attention to is the March of Dimes, which was a campaign. When we were children, they would have this little cardboard thing at the register. You were supposed to stick a dime in one of the slots. And all the dimes from all the stores in all the states would go for a polio cure. March of Dimes still exists. Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They decided they were going to work in all 50 states to affect a 0.08 legal limit for alcohol. They got that in all 50 states. They still exist. Right. So you always find that these groups, they just try to redefine themselves to get the next thing now. Turns out they really weren't doing this one thing altruistically. And what's really important to them is that they have jobs tomorrow. Now, I understand that. That would be important to me as well. But think about nuclear in that way, right? And you're going to see a lot of friction.
Emma, Norman.
So when I was reading Cooperation and Coercion, I had some troubles with, I guess, like the main concepts of the book, right? So pairing cooperation and coercion as two very different things. When cooperation, as laid out in the book, seemed more like a system of people all doing things individually that by happenstance would come together, whereas coercion was sort of laid out as anything that the government did. So I was just wondering what your guys' opinions are on why government actions are inherently coercive, and what truly makes a cooperative action, like what the differences are.
I think there's just a lot of difference, right? When government acts, you don't have the opportunity to say no thank you. You're going to do what the government says. And notice I don't just think that's automatically wrong. There are all kinds of things that government does that I'm perfectly comfortable with. Maybe less, maybe more so, and maybe less. I honestly don't know if we haven't had that conversation in a while. People cooperate, and that's what makes America so interesting, right? And you can go back and read Tocqueville. And Tocqueville, all he wants to talk about are the norms of civil society. It's never about what the government imposed. It's always about what the people wanted. And he talks about things that in our context would look like Little League, bowling leagues, book clubs, right? These sorts of things where people just come together to find other humans that are almost like them and share the time together. That's necessary too, right? If you want to have a fully human life, you're going to have to deal with other people, at least to some degree. And I don't think you can really say much more beyond these things, right? These are minimal concepts. They're not, the answers that come from them are not rich and colorful. These are more like bright line distinctions.
People often ask, push back on that. We'll say government is a coercive force. And people will say things like, no, it's not. You know, parking tickets, for example, there's no coercion here.
The hell it's not.
Sure, there's coercion. Every government edict, no matter how innocuous, is ultimately backed by threat of death. And the way you know that is by asking what happens if I resist. So you get a parking ticket. All right, don't pay it. Well, you get another one. Well, don't pay that. Well, you get a summons to go to court. Don't go. And then there'll be a bench warrant for your arrest. Well, don't go with the cops. Well, then they're going to bring out handcuffs. Fight them. Now you're going to die. Government action only looks like cooperation when you agree with it.
That's right.
So you say, okay, I'm going to do this. Otherwise, you see that it really is coercion. And you see the same thing with the voting. People say, well, we vote. We come to a decision. That's cooperation. It only is cooperation from the perspective of the majority. If you have voted in the minority, it's very much coercion.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that way. So that you've hit the place where I wouldn't go. Most people don't think about these things in these terms, but that doesn't mean these terms are not correct, right? And if you paint them very, very lightly, I think you get all kinds of ability to assess what you're looking at. We're trained not to see either one of these things. We're trained not to see cooperation because it's so basic. It's like, in another context, I say it's like asking a goldfish to describe what water is like. Of course, it's everywhere, but until you hear that it's everywhere, it doesn't occur to you that it's anywhere. On the other hand, we're all programmed to see heroes when we see law enforcement. I don't see that at all. On the best of days, I see groups of people doing a difficult job. On the worst of days, I see terrible people who should never be let anywhere near a gun, a stick, and a badge. I was watching a documentary last night as I tried to fall asleep. And I think it was from Minnesota, maybe Texas. I'm the only person that can't remember Minnesota or Texas. But a young man, 20 years old, black guy, got pulled over, and he became a little recalcitrant. I mean, just a little. He wasn't swinging at anybody. He was just shoving back a little. And they shot him right in the chest. He died in his car. He called his mother and said, "I'm scared." And it turns out he should have been. All right, that's coercion. That's the worst kind of coercion, but it's coercion. How much of that do you want? Because every single law carries with it a death penalty. And when we've gotten to the point now where no one person could even read the laws that we're subject to, that's literally impossible. Matter of fact, I'll make it even better. No one person in this room could read the United States tax code in a single year. They make so many changes that by the time you're to the end of it, at the end of a year, you have no choice but to start over again because it's different all the way through. When that's true, think about the disasters that are going to happen when none of us know what the laws really are. I don't. There's all kinds. I'm here with you guys in Missouri. I have no idea what the laws are like in Missouri. Just none. I take it as an article of faith that it's close enough to other places like that. So there's where our problem is. I think we're over lawyered. I think over legislated.
James tells a beautiful story. What's the thing about the law fitting in the brain of one man?
Yeah, law talkers in the ancient Nordic world had a position called the law talker. And at the end of the year, the law talker had to recite every law that society had. And any law he didn't recite was no longer a law. Right? It's a good thing, right? To make sure that people can, in fact, understand and follow the law. That means they have to know what the law is first. And there was this institutional mechanism. I think it was in Norway, that part of the world. It's laughable to think that somebody might be able to do that now. It's not possible.
Well, yeah, and what we have now is the exact opposite. You have, was it Nancy Pelosi saying we have to pass the Affordable Care Act to figure out what's in it. The people who are voting on the law themselves couldn't understand it.
Yeah, that was a real piece of work right there.
Robert. So I was wondering, because you said you changed it from anarchist to kind of sway the view, but you seem kind of anti-coercive. So how did you become an anarchist, and what made you want to change this view?
Why did you become an anarchist?
Oh, well, it was because there are some really compelling arguments for why almost everything the government does, the market could do better. And I still buy all of those arguments. The problem is they don't cover everything. And you see so many of these arguments that your natural inclination is to say, well, they cover everything. You don't need government at all. It turns out that you do. We do need some coercion, but it's a very, very small portion of what we currently do in terms of government. And perhaps the easiest thing to do is to recognize that all of the free market arguments, every argument I would make about the market can do this better than the government can do it. Every single one of those relies on the existence of defined and enforced property rights. If for no other reason you need a coercive force, to enforce the property rights that are the basis for all of the market interactions.
You know, when you start looking at the Constitution, at the things that, when you start looking at the things that are listed in the Constitution as being necessary for the, the first thing that came to my mind was something like courts of justice. And you could also, I think, look at Congress, right? The buildings that Congress meets in, the paychecks that congressmen make. There are all kinds of these clearly necessary things that cost a little bit of cash. And those things, I think, keep us all off the reservation for anarchists. It just doesn't get you there, right? Because there are these things that you will need. But here's the thing, when you look at the United States and its expenditures over time, from 1790, when we did the first census, to 1928, when Herbert Hoover became president, spending as a fraction of GDP was always, every one of those years, between 2.5% and 4%. It's clear that that's what a negative rights minimalist state costs. From 29 forward, the line just goes straight up and it doesn't stop, right? It hit the Affordable Care Act and then all of Trump's wizardry. And before you know it, it's just going to be, 50, 60, 70%. When last I checked, I think it was 42, 43, is that right?
All levels of government, I think, yeah.
Something like that.
But here's the argument that ultimately decided me. As we go back and forth on anarchism, one of the basic bases of the free market argument is that spontaneous order will evolve solutions. Leave people alone, they'll evolve solutions to things. And it suddenly occurred to me that government itself is the result of spontaneous order. You look throughout human history, and every time humans come together in groups, we form some form of government. That tells me that there has to be some value there that the market itself isn't providing, that every time we have an opportunity, we create this thing.
And we're back to Aristotle on this, because how it ends up getting framed by Aristotle, he doesn't really want to think about a national government. What he wants to think about is how you fit into your society, into your culture. And he says, look, you're going to be raised by a family. Why? Because a family is a natural unit. It simply exists. If you outlawed families tomorrow, you would still have families, right? Pre-political. But then your family kind of relates with other families in a certain part of town, a neighborhood. And then all these other neighborhoods too. And then before you know it, the neighborhoods all band together because they too have some sort of common interest. And before you know it, you started with the birth of a child and got institutional government as a result. And that's a strange thing. It's the part of Aristotle that nobody really talks about much. It's fallen out of vogue, but it's hard to say how it's not exactly right. You are already enculturated by the time you become politically aware. And that brings with it all kinds of realities, some good, some bad. But it's been the same since Aristotle walked the earth.
And I think people who are interested in the free market argument, I think we waste a lot of time arguing over anarchy, because the difference between anarchy and a free market environment is relatively small compared to the difference between where we are now and where ideally we should be. And so to the extent that anarchists and free market non-anarchists can put aside that question and say, look, we got bigger fish to fry. Let's go fry those.
And we've all got the same fight there, but what you find when you start moving in circles like we do, people pull you aside and they try to explain to you that they're more libertarian than you are, as if we would care, right? It's wholly irrelevant when there's so much space between what's decent and what we've got. We don't have to have the fight between the minarchists and the anarchists until these other fights are over.
The great thing James keeps repeating is, people who are saying this is a civil rights violation that I have to wear my mask. What are you fighting that for? You should be fighting the income tax. That's a much greater rights violation.
Every year they stick their hand right into your pocket and take everything they can get their fingers. And nobody complains about that. but I have to hear day in, day out how this is literally the worst thing ever. Don't get me wrong, I hate this. I'm not a big fan. But in the grand scheme of things, there are probably, 1 million, 2 million things that are worse than this.
Not possibly because we don't know about like taxation and stuff like that. Like the general public doesn't know all the rules with taxation, whereas this we're painfully aware of, or like more aware of than like taxation.
Yeah, and that relate to that, one of the reasons we're unaware is because of withholding,
That's the exact reason.
Yeah.
Not one of them.
because your taxes are withheld. If we had to write a check to the government every April 15th for everything we owe, the government would be a lot smaller today.
The government would collapse by about April 20th.
Right.
And I'm all for it, right? And people should know what they're being taxed for and what the tax level is. But the minute they start taking it out of your check before you even get your money, that was a stroke of brilliance right there. I remember my wife was damn near a commie when she was young. And she went off and got her first job after we got married. And she walked in, she was so pleased. She walked in and opened it up. And she had just divided and multiplied. She knew exactly what was going to be there. And of course it wasn't. And she looked at the check and she's, what the hell is FICA? And you saw her lose half of her commie status at that moment. The other half was lost when the state of New York would not allow us as a matter of law to homeschool our children.
Yeah.
It was a felony to
A
homeschool.
felony? Wow.
Yeah.
But this is why I argue strongly against a VAT, a value-added tax, like they have in Europe, because a VAT would do at the sales tax level the same thing that withholding does at income level. That you would go to the store and you would see a price tag, which included the value-added tax, and you would have no idea how much was taxed and how much was the product.
Oh,
So you talked a little bit about like what to keep in mind, like what to think about when deciding what you want to do, like with your career. So like, what do you think that some of the most important things are when you're deciding like what you want to do and figuring out your plan for that?
Yeah, I would go to, and James got me thinking about this. I would ask, of course, what you want to do is important, but I don't think it's the most important question. I think the most important question is, what do people need? Look around and what can I do, given my talents and given your needs, what can I do to help fulfill those? I think that's the key to success.
A couple of things. Many of your parents, grandparents have probably said to you something like, you can be anything you want. That is the most awful, pernicious advice anybody's ever given you. You can't be anything you want. You can be a lot of things, but you can't be any. I wanted to be power forward for the Boston Celtics. 5'10", not going to happen, right? Everybody knows. So discount that. And then ask the question that Ant's asked. How can you make everybody else happy? Because if you can figure out what's in your skill set that makes everybody else really happy, you're going to be wealthy and fulfilled. And you're never going to be able to know until you start asking around. So don't be bashful. Ask a lot of questions. Find people who own business and say, what are you looking for? Because they'll give you the answer. Why? Because they're looking for it. You might know where it is. So these sorts of things. And don't get locked in to any one thing. I even told my own children that I didn't care if they went to college or not. That's their call, not mine. And actually, we meet a lot of people, professors, who don't send their children to college, which should tell you something. One of which is Gary Gregg down in Louisville, Kentucky. His son, he encouraged him to be a welder. And now he makes 6 figures a year welding, because in Louisville, you have to weld very large brass vats to make the whiskey. And apparently, welding brass is almost impossible. So he learned to do it. Now he's the only guy in Kentucky who does it. How is that not better than anything he could have majored, right? He's up there with engineers. Those high skill, non-college requiring jobs, they outperform college graduates from 2/3 of the list of majors. So don't get caught up in it. And Ant said this a lot when we were still going on the road meeting with high school kids. I think it stands. whatever you end up doing for the rest of your life, it probably hasn't been invented yet. You're young, right? So the best thing you can do here is go ahead and acquire the best wide skill set you can. You should be able to do some high-end math. You should be able to write really well. You should know your history, right? These sorts of things. But don't get locked into any one idea, because the minute you do, you've cut out every other thing. And on that list of every other thing, going to be some really cool things. So let life happen, but be ready to happen to it when you've got the right answer. I think that's fair. Yeah.
Would you argue though that like even once you start to like begin what you want to do, you're not gonna know what everybody wants, because like by the time you actually get into the job, it'll probably change by then?
Yeah, I think so. It's always a dance that you end up doing with people. And, you know, when I was doing hiring for nonprofits, I would start with the realization that there's nobody in this stack of resumes who knows the first thing that I need them to know. So what would I look for? I looked for smart and interesting. And that yielded great results, right? And it was the interesting part that I think was a little different. At the end of interviews, I would say, what do you do that I would find fascinating? And people would say, blown sail, right? Probably just blew the interview. But I remember one kid looked up and he said, I write plays for children. It's an economics major. And I thought, you're hired, you're so hired. even if those plays suck, you are hired. And don't you know, he stayed with us for about 3 years, graduated, and walked right into middle management as a 22-year-old. So there you go. Be ready for weird answers.
I've just been calling on people randomly, like whose eyes look like they're ready to talk to something. We have 10 minutes left. Who have I not called on that has a burning question?
I'll go.
I was gonna say besides Haley. Go ahead.
Besides me, how do you go about continuing a conversation with someone who immediately goes to the government should do this?
I think the successful path is the longer path, and that's not to argue against the person, but rather ask. Let's take an example. Someone says the government should mandate a higher minimum wage. So ask the person, all right, what's the ramifications of that? So I would say, you know, what happens in the case where there's a business that sells its product at a certain price and can just afford its current workers, and now you're asking them to pay more? What happens here? And let the person give an honest answer, and then follow that answer with okay, what happens next? And what you're doing is taking the person from an opinion down into all the things that follow from that. And more often than not, you'll find the person questioning the opinion to begin with.
When we started doing appearances together, I would ask the same question in every room. And I'd say, okay, not including the military. This is sweep the military off your field of vision. Tell me anything that the government did according to plan, that worked out well, and came in at or under budget. If government's wonderful, you should have a list of answers for me that will keep going through the dinner hour. And I never got a single answer, not one. I think 3 years in, we were in the weirdest room we were ever in. It was a bunch of old people and a bunch of high school kids. And one old guy raised his hand and he said, the Hoover Dam. And I went, yes, the Hoover Dam. It did, it did everything that it was supposed to do. We have one example. And if we can only come up with one, government's probably not the mechanism to use. Not to say that I don't think we should do these things. I think we should. But in fitting government over the top inevitably yields terrible results. So you want to use it as little as possible. And then I would always say, or maybe you want to make it feel like you're at the DMV no matter where you go. Because everybody knows what a DMV fiasco is. We've all been through that.
Yeah, James said something important. And so many people go off the rails here when they have discussions like this. If someone says, I'll go back to minimum wage, that the government should mandate a higher minimum wage, and they sense you're arguing against them. In their mind, they hear you saying people shouldn't earn more money. And that's not what we're saying. We can both agree people should earn more money. Now, the question is, what's the best path to get there? And now you start asking, what are the ramifications of the path you think is right? Where does that actually leave us?
And what these people know, and or at least probably do, and what the uneducated or non-economist friends of ours, what they don't know, is that almost nobody makes minimum wage anyway. You're looking at roughly 3%. And then when you split out the ones who are tipped in a solid way, you're looking at 1%. But I mean, come on, you really want to put the worst of those people out of business entirely? There's so few of them. People down there, they need those jobs. And it's actually proof positive that 99% of us don't work for minimum wage, that it's not exactly necessary, right? If it were absolutely necessary, almost all of us would be making minimum wage and no more.
Yeah, the fact that 99% of jobs pay more than minimum wage indicates that whatever it is that pushes wages up, it isn't the minimum wage, it's something else. Let's figure out what that thing is, because that's the path to raising people's wages.
And the only time minimum wage does push people up in higher income brackets is when union contracts are tied to it. So in every bump in the minimum wage, smart union people write in that it will be a 20% boost here and a 10% boost there. So there are unseen things behind the veil there. But most people, regular people, if they knew just these few things, they would have a radically different approach on everything.
I need to finish my sentence because that's who I would call on next was like Haley. So besides that, otherwise I'm gonna call her. Who else would, like, we have time for maybe one or two more.
So what's the best, you just said that if everyone knew these few things that they would have radically different ideas. What's the best way to get that information out?
Slowly with great charity.
With great charity, yeah. I think that I have found the best way to get out is not to force feed the information, but rather draw people along with questions. You know, this goes back to what's the implication of what you're saying. And as you draw them along with questions, they'll reach a point where they'll say something, well, I don't know, blah. And now I can tell you, it's this. But if you just force feed them the information, they'll resist it in part because they don't see how it fits into their argument. You kind of have to push them until they get to the point that, okay, now I need this piece of information. What is it? Now I can tell
And this fits kind of nicely. When I was, I'm no longer a professor, but when I was, I would say to my students, look, I know so much more than you right now that it's unfair. I'm going to destroy whatever stupid argument you have. Unless you realize what I'm doing, and here's what I'm always going to do. I'm going to say, can't we all agree? And the minute you say yes, I've already won. Because I know what all the next steps of this argument are. It's like watching a chess game play out. It only plays out the one way. So you best find a way to disagree with me if you want to on the premises. But if you look at the premises and you think they're reasonable, you're going to have a different answer by the time we get all the way down to the end of this one. You should be okay with that. You're 19 years old. You should be changing your mind a lot. And I found that when I would be charitable like that, students would be okay. And I said, look, I hold strong opinions. You don't need to hold them to do well in my class. Just make your case and write it up as best you can. Right? And your politics and your religion have no place in your grade. And once I was able to get them to believe that, miracles would happen. So it's kind of grafting that onto conversations I now have with other sorts of people.
And often what you have to bear in mind is when you have conversations with people about stuff like this, don't have your end goal to convince them of your position. Rather have as your end goal to cause them to question theirs. And often what will happen is, you'll have this conversation, the person won't agree with you and they'll go away, but you got them thinking about it. And it might be 6 months, it might be a year, it might be 10 years before they're having similar conversations with other people. And then that seed you planted starts to bear fruit.
10 years is an interesting thing, because that tends to be what I see. I get email from students 10 years prior, so long ago that I barely remember who they are. And they send me the exact same email all the time. I'm sorry, I thought you were such an asshole. It turns out you were right about a couple of things. And I take that as an unbelievable success. Fine, 10 years down the road, fine. It wasn't forever down the road. And I'll fight the long game, that's fine.
And this is why it's so important to be civil in the conversation, because if I say, look, you're an idiot and here's why, that conversation is not going to stick, it's not going to grow fruit, because it's not going to be the person will, but if I'm civil with you, that conversation will stay in the person's head.
Will,
What, if any, would you consider the free market to not address properly or enough? Like, is there a crux to the free market argument for certain solutions to problems we have?
The free market does not address well any instance in which property rights are vague. And you'll see this as you study economics. So instances of public goods and common resources, or particular things. We've argued in the past that not all taxation is theft, and people lose their minds when we say this. But if you follow that argument, you'll find that yet there are certain places where taxes are necessary and they end up not being theft, but there are always instances in which there's some property right that hasn't been or can't be well defined.
Yeah, and you look at problems with the commons, it's all kind of the same here. Listing things that a free market can't address is tough. I have almost no list, but I don't have no list. And I guess I'm falling in line with Aunt Lockstep here. Those minimal things. I'll think about it more, but honestly, I've been thinking about it for 20 years. And I just don't see it, right? What you see is, you see markets failing sometimes. And that's inevitably because of the political pressures launched on a market, which means the market's not exactly free in the first place. So those sorts of things, right? There are all kinds of bad actors that markets mostly filter out, but they don't filter all of them out. I would prefer if it were a little better there. That's all I've got.
and on that note, this is your last opportunity to write at MIT.
It was really nice meeting all of you. Hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you both.
Thank you.